about forgotten characters in American history, I could mention the Civil War general who was most famous for losing a battle that saved the Union. Or I could talk about the respected politician soldier who was placed in charge of both the commission to investigate the conspiracy to assassinate President Lincoln and into the treatment of prisoners at the notorious Andersonville prison. Or I could talk about the territorial governor who negotiated a pardon with the famous outlaw, Billy the Kid. I could talk about all that and still be talking about the same person, and I would not even have come close to talking about all the interesting things that he did. Oh, and if I didn't mention it, he also wrote one of the most popular novels of the 19th century. If you don't recognize his name, you'll almost certainly recognize the name of his novel. Lew Wallace is quite possibly the most interesting person that you've probably never heard of, and his story deserves to be remembered. Lew Wallace was born into a political family on April 10, 1827. His father, David Wallace, was a West Point graduate and attorney who served as governor of Indiana and then as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. As a youth, Lew Wallace was a poor student, but he showed talent for writing. He was studying to be an attorney when, in 1846, at just the age of 19, he was appointed a second lieutenant in Company H, the 1st Indiana Volunteer Infantry, a unit that he helped to raise. He spent a year in the company during the Mexican War, but did not see combat. He was an opponent of slavery, and mustering out in 1847, operated a newspaper in Indiana that supported the Free Soil movement, opposing the expansion of slavery into the Western Territories. He was a successful lawyer and served in the Indiana Senate, but he remained active in the militia, helping to organize a unit in Crawfordville, Indiana. When the Civil War started, Wallace was appointed the Indiana State Adjutant General, responsible for organizing and recruiting volunteers into the Union Army. 6 regiments were recruited in Indiana within a week, and Wallace was commissioned a colonel in command of the 11th Indiana Volunteer Infantry Regiment. He proved to be an able commander, earning particular praise for his initiative in the February 1862 Battle of Fort Donelson. By March, he was promoted to Major General at age 34, the youngest in the U.S. Army. But then disaster struck his military career in the April 1862 Battle of Shiloh. Wallace's division had been held in reserve, and when General Ulysses Grant ordered him forward, the order was taken verbally by an aide. A controversy followed for years whether the order stipulated which road to take to the battlefield, or exactly where Wallace was supposed to arrive. He moved his division to support the Union left, but the flank had been driven back, and he was forced to countermarch. The mistake meant that his reinforcements did not arrive until the end of the day on April 6th. While his division performed well on the 7th, flanking the Confederate Army and forcing them to retreat, the battle included very high Union losses. Grant, who himself had been accused of poor leadership during the battle, placed most of the blame on Wallace, insisting that Wallace had disobeyed orders and taken the wrong road, and thus so delayed the reserves that had nearly cost the Union the battle. Wallace would spend the rest of his life defending his actions at Shiloh, insisting that the orders had been unclear. He would get some vindication later in life, but at the time it cost his military reputation dearly. When the Union Army of the Tennessee was reorganized in April, Wallace was removed from command and placed in the reserve. While the so-called Shiloh controversy would dog him throughout his military career, he demonstrated that he was still an able commander through various commands and smaller battles later in the war. In July 1864, Wallace was in command of the Union Army's 8th Corps, a force of mainly lightly trained volunteers that had been raised for garrison duty, freeing veteran troops for combat. Grant was engaged in the Siege of Petersburg, a lengthy campaign against entrenched troops of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Wallace's command, far from the front, was indicative of his service after Shiloh. 1864 had seen actions by both the Union and the Confederacy in the Shenandoah Valley. In June, Lee had sent a corps under Lieutenant General Jubal Anderson Early to clear the valley of Union troops, and then to threaten Washington, D.C. in the hopes of diverting forces away from Petersburg. Early found more success than he expected, bypassing Harper's Ferry and crossing the Potomac. He came within 2 days' march of Washington, D.C., which had been nearly stripped of troops and was virtually defenseless. All that stood between Early's corps of nearly 16,000 men and the U.S. Capitol were the 2,300 volunteers of Wallace's 8th Corps. Not knowing whether Early's intent was Washington, D.C. or Baltimore, Wallace moved his corps to defend a junction near Frederick, Maryland that controlled several crossings across the Monocacy River. The mission was direct. His tiny group of outnumbered and largely inexperienced troops had to hold back a force of nearly 7 times their number, long enough for reinforcements to arrive to defend Washington and Baltimore. With characteristic initiative, Wallace moved his command, established a defensive plan intended to both delay Early and force him to reveal his intent and strength. His force was strengthened by some 3,300 men under the command of Brigadier General George Ricketts, who had been dispatched by Grant to Harper's Ferry. The combined Union force was now some 6,800, but they were faced by more than twice that number. Early approached the junction on July 9th. Wallace's plan was simple: delay Early as long as possible and preserve a line of retreat for his force. Wallace's position was a good one. The east bank of the Monocacy is higher than the west, making a natural breastwork. A flanking attack by Early's cavalry failed when it ran into Ricketts' men. Although finally pressed back by force of numbers, Wallace's outnumbered force withstood 5 Confederate attacks and held for more than 6 hours before retreating towards Baltimore. The delay turned out to be critical. By holding back Early for a day, Wallace had given the Union Army enough time to come and reinforce Washington, D.C. and defend Fort Stevens outside the capital. It was there that Early's force was stopped and eventually forced to retreat. The Battle of Monocacy was extraordinary. Lewis had shown both initiative and tactical brilliance. He was the general that lost a battle that saved the Union. At first, Grant, hearing that Wallace had retreated, relieved him of command, but when Grant and Congress realized the significance of his efforts, he was restored to command. Grant later said of Wallace, "If Early had been but 1 day earlier, he might have entered the capital before the arrival of reinforcements I had sent. General Wallace contributed on this occasion, by the defeat of the troops under him, a greater benefit to the cause than often falls to the lot of a commander of an equal force to render by means of victory." Still, Wallace never commanded troops in the field again. Towards the end of the war, Grant sent him to Texas, where he engaged in an ultimately fruitless effort to negotiate a surrender of Confederate troops in the West. Following the war, Wallace was a member of the military commission that tried the Lincoln assassination conspirators and presided over the trial of Henry Wirz, who was commandant at the infamous Camp Sumter prison camp, commonly called Andersonville. After the testimony of 158 witnesses, Wirz was found guilty of conspiracy and murder and sentenced to death by hanging. While there's been some controversy over Wirz's conviction and whether he was a scapegoat who could not have done much given the camp's overcrowding and lack of supply and support from the Confederacy, the trial conducted by Wallace set important precedents, including the precedent that certain actions are unacceptable, even if carried out under orders. The trials, however, had held Wallace back from another interest. While in Texas in 1865, Wallace had met with members of the Mexican government, then facing the foreign intervention called the Maximilian Affair. With the Civil War behind them, the U.S. had taken an interest in the affair, especially as many former Confederate soldiers were fighting on behalf of the Austro-Hungarian Emperor. Wallace resigned his commission in 1865 and went to Mexico to support the government of Benito Juarez. It's unclear exactly how significant Wallace's role, which largely consisted of efforts to provide much-needed weapons to Juarez's forces, was in the outcome of the war. But it is clear that Wallace's efforts, both in Mexico and in advocating to the government in Washington, helped to convince Emperor Napoleon III to withdraw French forces from Mexico. However, Wallace was not paid nearly what he'd expected to be paid and lost money on the arms that he'd helped to procure for Juarez. Wallace returned to Indiana and practiced law. He ran unsuccessfully for Congress, but in 1878 he was appointed by President Rutherford B. Hayes as governor of the New Mexico Territory. It was a dangerous time in the New Mexico Territory, with violence related to land disputes with the Apache, and a conflict in Lincoln County where a fight over control of the county had resulted in the series of violent events that became known as the Lincoln County War. Among his efforts to quell the violence, Wallace made an agreement with one of the most famous of the participants in the Lincoln County War, William Bonney, better known as Billy the Kid. Wallace promised a pardon for Bonney's previous crimes in exchange for testimony, but after he testified, the local district attorney refused to honor the pardon. Billy broke out of jail, committed further crimes. He was arrested and convicted in March of 1881, and Wallace consented to sign the order for his execution. Billy escaped one more time, but was caught and killed in July. Some complained that Wallace had betrayed Billy the Kid, but the situation was more complex, as Billy's further crime spree, including killing 2 deputies while escaping jail, forced Wallace's hand. In general, Wallace was seen to have calmed the dangerous situation in New Mexico during his tenure. But he'd also done something else. While in New Mexico, Lew Wallace, who had not shown much success as a student and yet had shown much promise as a writer in his youth, had finished his second novel, a novel that Amy Lifson of the National Endowment for the Arts described as the book that shook the world. The book centers on the story of a Jewish prince from Jerusalem who was enslaved by Romans and whose life intersected with Jesus. The book's fictional title character, named Judah Ben-Hur, allowed Wallace to tell the tale of Christ without offending Christians who would not have accepted Christ as the main character in a novel. The book Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, published in 1880, would become the most popular book in America, its sales surpassing Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Leifson described the novel as the most influential Christian book written in the 19th century. It was an odd accomplishment for a man who, while he insisted that he believed in the Christian idea of God, also said that he was not a member of any church or denomination, nor had he ever been. In fact, Wallace admitted that the idea for the book came when he had a discussion with an agnostic, and that reminded him how little he understood of his own religion. While initial sales were modest and the reception among literary critics was cool, the book found popular appeal. Leifson notes, "Since its first publication, Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, has never been out of print. It outsold every book except the Bible until Gone with the Wind came out in 1936, and resurged to the top of the list again in the 1960s. By 1900, it had been printed in 36 English-language editions and translated into 20 others, including Indonesia and Braille. The book was the first novel ever to have been blessed by the Pope, Pope Leo XIII. By 1889, the book had sold more than 400,000 copies. Among the book's fans were Presidents Grant and Garfield and former Confederate President Jefferson Davis. The book is often credited with bringing acceptance by American Christians to the novel as a literary form and later introducing otherwise reticent Christian audiences to theater and film. The novel has seen at least 5 major motion picture adaptations, with the 1907 film serving as an early defense of copyright, as it was done without permission and the filmmakers were sued by Wallace's heirs. The 1959 adaptation won a record 11 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. Besides saving Washington, D.C., preserving Mexican independence, and pardoning Billy the Kid, and writing one of the most influential novels ever written, I haven't even begun to list all the amazing things that Lew Wallace did in his life. Under President Garfield, he was the U.S. minister to the Ottoman Empire. He was an inventor who held 8 patents. He wrote several other books, novels, and poems, and was a well-regarded artist. He crafted violins. In 1898, when the Spanish-American War started, he offered to raise a unit in Indiana to go to the war. When he was refused due to his age, he tried to enlist at the age of 71. Lew Wallace passed away in 1905 at the age of 77. Once one of the most famous people in America, his name is little remembered today, but his life and works are commemorated at the General Lew Wallace Study and Museum in Crawfordsville, Indiana. His sculpture, by sculptor Andrew O'Connor, is enshrined in the National Statuary Hall collection of the United States Capitol. Wallace is the only novelist whose statue is included in the hall. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.